The Liberating Arts seeks to articulate the enduring relevance of a liberal arts education during a time of pandemic and protest. Through our online platform, we will host a series of conversations with writers, academics, institutional leaders, and public intellectuals about the nature of the liberal arts, their formational purpose, and their moral significance in a time of great cultural disruption. We hope to inspire viewers and listeners to learn more about the liberating effects of these arts on their own lives. To find out more, please visit www.theliberatingarts.org or find us on Twitter, Facebook, Spotify, or YouTube.
Welcome, everyone. I am here to talk to Alan Noble. My name is Brad East. I am part of the Liberating Arts Project. I teach theology at Abilene Christian University, and we are talking today to Alan Noble. Alan is Associate Professor of English at Oklahoma Baptist University. He is Editor-in-Chief of Christ and Pop Culture, which you should check out online. He is the author of this book, Disruptive Witness, Speaking Truth in a Distracted Age. In fact, I have a group presentation of students who will be talking about that book in just a few weeks in one of my classes. I believe he has one or two forthcoming books. He might tell us about those in a moment. And we wanted to talk to Alan for many reasons, but he just published about a month ago an essay for Christianity Today, which we'll have in the show notes, called the title, the very online title with two complete sentences rather than a proper essay title, is called Christian Colleges Are in Crisis. Here's what that means for the church. So welcome, Alan. Feel free to fill in any of the gaps in my introduction, but I thought we would start out with your essay. And I have some specific questions about it, but why don't you tell us about the essay, its genesis, and what you were trying to do with it?
I just want to, as you know, titles are always written by the editor. So I was just looking up the title I sent them, which I knew they wouldn't accept. But so I think I had it as Why We Need Christian Colleges and Universities as the World Falls Apart, which is still pretty online. It's still pretty online, but it's only one sentence, not two. So yeah. That's half. I'm sorry. What was your question? You had a question.
Tell us about the essay. Where did it come from, and what were you wanting to do with it?
Yeah. So for a long time, I teach at Oklahoma Baptist University, and we are a liberal arts university. I get to teach a course sequence called Western Civilization, where we teach from the Romans right up through the 90s, the early 2000s. In Western civilization, and we teach that not because we are convinced the Western civilization is better than everybody else, but because this is where we are. Shawnee, Oklahoma is in the West, and we need to know where we are and how we got here before we expand outward. That experience of teaching in a liberal arts institution has given me a conviction about how imperative it is that my students and the rest of the church understands where they are historically, what came before us. I like to tell my students that the world that we live in is very strange, and they don't realize it because this is the only world that they've known. And going to the ancient world, going to the medieval world, and thinking about things like individualism and community and authority and hierarchy is essential, I think, for understanding what's strange about our own time, and therefore for being good citizens and believers. So with that conviction, I've been, I also care very deeply about what's going on in my own country, and it's insane right now, as 2020 has been very particularly unusually strange and challenging. And as I thought through some of the problems that I saw in contemporary American society, and I thought about the work that we're able to do with the liberal arts, not just literature, which is what I teach, not even just history, which is what I teach with a partner, but all of the sciences, the psychology, all of these things, theology. I came to the conviction that this is a very powerful and I think needed way not of fixing everything, because I don't think in those kind of simplistic terms, but of what I called shoring up the ruins, of pulling things together, of getting a sufficient necessary basis for living in a world that is antagonistic towards our faith, but also to humans as they were designed by God. So I had that conviction, and as you well know, there's a lot of institutions that are in crisis mode right now, and so that was weighing on me, as I have friends who have been laid off, and I was seeing the donations going to political campaigns. Evangelicals have a lot of money that they're willing to donate, and I thought, man, I really think that we could do a lot of good. We have the resources to do a lot of good if we would choose to invest in our institutions that are doing this, shoring up the ruins. And so I pitched it to CT, and they said, okay. And then they changed the title.
Yeah, as editors are wont to do.
Yeah.
Okay, so there are a few different directions I want us to go in, and I'll let you choose, because your essay and your concerns touch on all of them. One is what you identify as the present crisis, all of the many factors that have converged in 2020. And that's also what led to the creation of the liberating arts, that, as many people have said, especially in theological circles, this time is apocalyptic, not only in the doomsday sense, though it certainly can feel that way, but also in the revelation sense, that it unveils truths about our situation that we might want to shove under the rug in ordinary times, but you can't in the light of day. And so one direction is, what are the acute challenges facing us at this very moment, or that have been brought to light in the last 3 to 6 months? So that's one path. Second path is, we're not only facing that acute crisis. The problems in higher ed, the problems for institutions like yours and mine, Christian higher ed, have been germinating for a long time. This is not new. We've been reading doomsday articles for a long time, and it was certainly exacerbated about a dozen years ago by the financial crisis. You and I think, were both earning our PhDs or considering it or coming out in that time frame. Yeah. And what we're hearing now is what we were hearing then, which is no jobs, institutions are dying, people are being laid off, so on and so forth. And so there's that second path to where, even if 2020 hadn't happened, we'd still be looking down the barrel of long-term issues that require wise and thoughtful response. And then third is this interplay between faith, liberal arts, and the formation that students receive. The channel that this interview is going to be a part of, we have 4 different channels on the website, and one of them is about formation and the way in which the liberal arts are not about beaming information from my brain into my students' brains, although we do, of course, want them to know things that they didn't know before. We want them to have information. We want them to learn discrete facts that they could report to us or be examined on. But that's not the primary thing we're interested in. We're interested in formation. But that, for you and for me at institutions like ours, that intersects with both faith and with the liberal arts. But neither of those things is limited to, as you talk about in the essay, neither of those is limited to job training.
Right.
You have a couple great lines in here, which I'll read for folks. You say, "We are under pressure to reduce our education to efficiently targeted career training and certification, rather than the cultivation of wisdom." And then in parentheses, "a goal with a much harder to measure return on investment." And then you say also, "Our schools, properly funded and supported, can be beacons of light for the church during a time of crisis, or they too can crumble into highly efficient, baptized career and bureaucracy training centers." That last phrase is, is just that's an abyss of darkness to
That's
hear,
right.
but it is all too true, at least as a temptation. So those are the three paths, and I'm happy for you to sort of pick which one you'd like to talk about: the present crisis, the long-term challenges that have been bubbling up to the surface, or that kind of that convergence of themes regarding liberal arts, faith formation, career training, etc.
Okay, so I'm going to start with formation because I think it also touches on the long-standing crises in Christian higher education, because it
Yeah.
also has to do with that these questions of efficiency, which is also in some way coming to a head. So I'm going to just try to answer them all because they're all so interesting.
Yeah, exactly.
So one of the reason I love my job so much is because of formation. One of the challenges last semester in teaching only online was that I couldn't have students come into my office and just talk with me about life. There's something powerful that can happen when you discuss a work of literature, or you're discussing history with students, or how to write a research paper, and they come into your office and you get to counsel them using the topics that you've discussed in class, putting it in conversation with faith in their contemporary life. Excuse me. That for me is where a lot of the formation happens. Some of my most meaningful moments have essentially been preaching the gospel to students and the context of how they see themselves in a class. Am I successful? Can I do this? Am I phony? Am I going to belong? And which echoes into this larger question: can I ever get a job? Can I ever succeed in life? Am I ever going to make it? And all of those anxieties are tied to this emphasis upon efficiency and productivity as sort of the absolute good. That creates this anxiety for students. So to be able to teach them literature, to, as I said earlier, reveal to them the fact that our world is very weird and we don't have to think in terms of, for example, individualism, that we can think in terms of virtue as well. Those things help form them. But then also my conversations in my office are often, and especially over time, I mean, the ability to because a liberal arts university has a strong core, that means that I often see students who aren't English majors for potentially 4 semesters. 2 years of having the same student who's not my major is wonderful, because what happens is I can form close relations with a student who's in music, and we can talk about faith, and I can help him think through things, or help her think through things. And I've actually have a number of music majors who regularly come in and we talk. And that's a unique opportunity that, in my experience, the liberal arts has allowed for. Now, it's also, in a sense, inefficient. The time that I spend sitting with a student, talking with them about life, about how they perceive themselves in the world, how they perceive their work in school, and then their work outside of school and their place in the world, all those things are, from a certain perspective, inefficient. I could be grading more, I could be teaching an additional class. Sitting with a student who needs to vent for an hour and a half is, from a certain perspective, a costly use of my time. And that, I think, gets to one of the old crises. There, as I say in that article, there are all kinds of pressures. Some of them are coming from the federal government through regulations and certifications and certain majors. And so if one degree requires a certain number of hours, then everybody else has to sort of adjust. Otherwise, we lose that degree plan, and that we can't afford that. And so some of it's sort of federal and it moves down. Some of it I think a lot of it is just market driven. A lot of students and parents, when they think about higher education, they're thinking, how can I help my child have a good career, exclusively in those terms. And so that means that the Common Core, the liberal arts, all these things that are beautifully inefficient, as the president of my university says, beautifully, I think he says beautifully inefficient. Those things need to be cut out, because they're really not going to help somebody necessarily find a job. Now, um, so in my opinion, those are some of the crises that have long been boiling up in Christian higher education. We're under the same pressure that everybody else is, but we ought to have a strong conviction that those pressures are not legitimate pressures. That streamlining things as efficiently as possible in order to get students careers is not actually loving our students. And this beautifully inefficient formation that can happen around the cafeteria tables and in offices and outside on walks, that kind of formation is is transformative in precisely the way that our society needs today, because so few people are grounded in timeless truths, and that's precisely what we need. So I don't know how many questions I answered. I went down a couple.
yeah,
Yes,
you're answering
kind of,
all and more.
I'm
Yeah, I
trying.
mean, I think I would add in terms of a comment on the question of efficiency. On the one hand, people like you and I who teach in bookish subjects, we want to kind of stick it to the economists and say something like it's beautifully inefficient, because economic rationality can colonize our imaginations, certainly colonize our budgets, colonize the decisions we make. But on the other hand, what does efficiency mean? It has to do with a goal, a telos.
Right.
If the goal is to get 18-year-olds in and out of a jobs training program as quickly as possible, and there are such things and they can be good for people. But if
Yeah.
that's what you're meant to be doing, then of course reading Cormac
Right.
McCarthy doesn't contribute to that.
Yeah.
It is an inefficient use of resources, time, money, energy, etc.
Yeah.
If you as a professor of English are meant, if you're in the business of, in Christian language, shaping souls, in more higher ed language,
Right.
forming citizens, forming character, contributing to holistic the holistic formation of folks who you want to participate in human flourishing, then that's a very good use of resources.
It is.
It's not
And
inefficient, far from it.
yeah, the trick is that most, or commonly, we think of efficiency as something that we can measure. And as I said in the article, the challenge is the things you just described, that soul formation. We try, right? So I think probably every institution has some kind of metrics they want to see. Okay, or
Yeah.
but I think most of us know that an incredibly coarse metric. It's not fine tuned, and because it can't be, because we're talking about wisdom. But yeah, so I would say I don't. It's not wasteful. Properly understood, it is working towards the right telos, but um, um, but it's also not measurable, and that takes a degree of faith. I mean, I think parents, donors, administrators, and students have to be able to say, okay, I believe the practice of reading texts in community and discussing them is valuable for the formation of a human being. And I'm okay if I can't come out with some clear outcomes that are chartable and measurable that shows that this student's soul has been transformed. Because I've had so many students, you know, after college that, okay, now it clicks, right? Or semesters later, they might have been terrible students in the first semester, but after we've stopped measuring for a certain thing, the fourth year, they come back to me and they're like, man, this was great. And so I'm like, so I think that's, for me, that's a key. And that goes back to these, well, they're part of the recent crises. We're anxious to prove that what we're doing has value, has measurable value, so that we can justify tuition and loans, federal loans and stuff. And that's not inherently a problem, but I think we have to acknowledge that some of the things we do just aren't going to work that way.
Yeah,
and that's okay.
Yeah, and what can be measured by economic outcomes, or what even does or does not lead to economic outcomes, is not the exclusive or even the primary measure of what we're up to. So you mentioned ways of forming students, relating to students outside of the classroom. Since you're an English prof, when a student, an administrator, a parent of a potential student asks you, "What is literature good for?"
Yeah.
What do you say? What's your elevator pitch? You're not going to say, "Well, it's going to make the memos you write in your business a little bit less grammatically bad." I assume that's not going to be your primary answer. So instead of the liberal arts, all of them, yours is lit. What's it good for?
Yeah. So there are some popular and I think probably valid arguments that it increases empathy. My concern with that is that we're looking for measurable outcomes, and there might be a faster way to increase empathy. If we can create a drug that would increase empathy, do we just get rid of English departments? Like, stop reading books, we don't need them. You have a drug to do it. So that to me is problematic, that framing. So instead, here's how I understand literature. I understand literature, and really, I think all works of art, but it's a thesis I'm working through, as attempts by fallen people in God's world to tell some truth about that world. Now, because we're fallen, we can't tell those truths with complete accuracy, but we also can't completely escape from it. And that it also means that both Christian and non-Christian authors are going to accurately tell or come close to telling some truths about the world. And that, of course, is what, in my experience, what I've found in literature, that it is often the case that maybe an Ernest Hemingway, who, although at times he dabbled in Catholicism, for the most part, not a believer, but he was able to reveal truths about the human heart that are important to understand. They are important to understand for our own existence in this world, but they're also important for understanding how others think and how we got where we are. It's also the case that when you can think about, in my mind, when you can think about literature in that way, then you're also free to enjoy it as beautiful without obsessing over worldview. I feel like in my earlier years in evangelicalism as a homeschooler, I was trained too much to look for, okay, what is the ideology behind this? And so, okay, once I can categorize it, so then I can say, okay, well, that's what this is, and I'm a Christian, so this is why they are wrong, and then I sort of move on. But when you can understand texts as pathetic, always in some sense pathetic, but earnest, hopefully, attempts to tell some truth about the world, then you can just, when you see someone doing that and it's done well, you can enjoy its beauty and you can delight in it, and you can praise God that some truth is told even despite the ignorance or defiant or rebellion of the author. So those are some important things for me. I think that good literature puts a mirror up to society and forces us to see things that we regularly do not want to see. So that's an important aspect of literature. Literature will take the time to criticize things that we don't want to criticize, that we don't want to acknowledge and wrestle with. It's also the case, I believe, that there is this formative power of reading a book, the practice of charity, of saying, I'm not going to necessarily agree with what this author is saying, but I'm going to show them the charity of desiring to understand what they're saying. And that practice, I ask my students, speaking of formation in the class, I ask my students to have the books out in front of them, because I think that posture where we're before the text, not that we're submitting to the text, but we're acknowledging that the text deserves our attention, that we're going to attend to words, attend to sentences and paragraphs and ideas and images. I think that has many benefits, and one of them is that it gets us out of our own heads. We tend to be very self-centered people and encouraged to be very self-centered and people. And when you're when you're attending to a text, then you have to push that aside and you have to contemplate. These are all skills that are very essential to Christians. So, um, yeah, I guess that'd be my elevator pitch.
Okay, great. Yeah. I mean, and I think the challenge for answering a question like that, communicating the value and goodness of the liberal arts, of literature, of theology, so on and so forth, is striking a path between instrumentalizing it. It's good for some other thing, but also ornamentalizing it, making it a kind of nice decorative feature of one's life, but not sort of like not speaking to the heart, cutting to the very essence of what matters. So one of the things you talk about in the essay is the necessity and goodness of institutions and what it means to support institutions. Talk to me about both the both within the university and without. So within has to do with not just faculty, but administrators and folks who lead the university and make decisions. Mm-hmm. And then without the university, on the outside of the university, are folks who potential donors, churches, families, neighborhoods, prospective parents and students. What would it mean, both on the inside and on the outside, what would it mean, what do I want to say, to foster and cultivate a culture of support for institutions like ours, Christian or non-Christian, but liberal arts, higher education, given what's sort of in the cultural waters about higher ed at this moment, coming from multiple angles. What would it mean? I mean, if you could just dream this and it came into being, what would that look like for parents and neighborhoods and churches and civic organizations, as well as administrators? Because sometimes it's folks on the inside who are laying the termites at the foundation, right? Who are eventually going to eat away at the very thing they're meant to serve. That's not always the case, but sometimes it is. Right. So how do we foster that, and what would it look like?
How do we foster it? Yeah, or what would it look like? So the fostering is a real challenge. I mean, one of the reasons I wrote the article was hoping to help foster that, because
right.
I don't feel like there's a lot of it, but I do feel like the benefits of institutions, particularly Christian liberal arts institutions, that are that lean into their institutionality, that own it and excel at it. The benefits of that, I think, touch on a lot of the values that that evangelicals have, and they're looking to get those values met through maybe political means or some other sort of means. And I wanted to say, I agree with a lot of those goals. There's a long-term, deeper, more slow but meaningful way to approach that, and that's through these institutions. So I'm not sure how to foster it. I would love to have answers. I think everyone would, because it, well, let me tell you what I think it would look like first, and then maybe we can dream about how to foster it. So within an institution, I think it would involve the employees, everyone having the mindset that they are not primarily individual employees, but they are part of an institution that is serving a community, that is doing good in a community. There's a tendency, really, everywhere in society, to think so much in terms of careers, and this, of course, goes both ways. As you mentioned, it's administration, but it's also faculty. And of course, if you have an administration who treats you as disposable, then you have to think in terms of careers, because you have to feed your family. So you have to think in terms of, okay, what do I have to prepare for next, right? But if you have administration and faculty that can commit to a vision and pursue that as a common good, not a private good, but a common good, then I think that takes loyalty, that takes trust, that takes commitment to one another, and a shared vision. I suspect it's the case that in most institutions there are some parts of the campus who, at most Christian liberal arts institutions, excuse me, that there are some parts of the campus that faculty and administration that really don't either understand the liberal arts or care about them. And a lot of that has to just do with education. I mean, frankly, I did not know what the liberal arts were until I was at Baylor, getting my PhD. No one had told me what it was. I went to a state community college and then a state college for my master's. I had no idea. So I think it would entail having everyone committed to that vision, understanding that formation is key. Sometimes what we can do as a sort of shortcut to the deep personhood formation that can happen in a liberal arts, sometimes institutions can talk in terms of spiritual change. So they can say things like, it's really important for us that our students, are growing in Christ, which is true. It's important that they are transformed. And if you don't define what those things mean, then you can think, well, I guess we're doing a good job at the liberal arts if we have a Bible study after classes, or we have a really good chapel service, right? But when the institution from the inside understands that this vision involves deep knowledge, formation of habits, cultivation of good habits and virtues, then I think you're going to see the results from that. And I think also that the people who want to be involved in an institution like that will, I think, commit themselves quite a bit. Now, outside, and this is such a great challenge, because it's the fundamental challenge of I think, preaching, which is this: how do you get people to sit down in a seat while you tell them that they are sinners? I don't know how pastors do it. The Holy Spirit, I guess, because nobody wants to be told that they're in sin and they need to repent. But if no one comes in, then the pastor can't preach. But the same thing is true, I think, for the liberal arts. We know that we're offering a good for people, but very often the people we're offering it to don't understand that it is a good. And that's a great challenge, I think, for us. Because if you're a donor and I can come to you and I can say, as a politico, and I can say, if you donate this to a political campaign, we can accomplish these goals in canvassing or whatever, and I can give you specific metrics, and it's clear, and the election's a few weeks away, and you're like, okay, I can see immediate results for this. That feels more tangible than saying, well, if you endow a scholarship, then over time, students will have a deeper understanding of God's created world and their place in it, and they will slowly make their communities better places. You might never see that. Well, I mean, that's just reality. But so the question for me becomes, how do we communicate that? And I think it's very difficult. But if institutions if these Christian institutions think themselves as outward facing, as, okay, how do I serve the churches in my community? How can I bring churches in to help educate pastors and have seminars and conferences and things, so that a local community thinks that college is ours. That college is here for us. It's helping us. I'm invested in this and I care about this place and I want to be involved in it. I think that might be one way of doing it. And that's, I think, what the role of a university should be. I think it should be for the cultivation of Christian intelligence, wisdom, and cultural creation in specific communities. So that would include, in my dream scenario, I think it would include, and I think it needs to, for the long-term health of institutions, very large endowments, specifically for tuition for scholarships.
Yeah,
so that
I was about to say specifically for you and me. We would like endowed chairs and something. That would.
I would like an endowed chair. I would before an endowed chair. I would prefer tuition. I think my job would be easier if students were less stressed.
Oh, it's 100% true. I have students who are working 40-hour jobs. I mean, and
That's not possible.
Making it, so it's kind of a sink or swim. Some it ruins them, and some it's like every second of their day for 7 days a week is planned out. They know when they're in class, they know when they're at work, and they know when they're doing homework. And it's, on the one hand, remarkable to behold. On the other hand, it should not be necessary. So I agree, of course. I will allow my chair to be endowed after the students receive their scholarships. And that's an excellent point, that's something that you can pitch to donors. And I will say, to your comment about sort of return on investment, of course, it's true in a sense that giving to something that feels concrete, like a political campaign or whatnot, that's focused on a policy or a person or an election, might appear to have an immediate and measurable return on investment, compared to, say, endowing scholarships and saying this is going to form future people in wisdom and faith in order to contribute to society as good neighbors. I want to say that granting that claim on those terms, there's another sense in which putting money into politics is a risky bet, and even if you succeed, it could fail the next day. I mean, successes and wins in politics are ephemeral. They're vaporous. They often don't last, or they have unintended consequences. But if you were to invest in students at liberal arts colleges, in our case, in Christian higher ed, that kind of impact could be not only long lasting, but could touch countless people, and through the actual students who come through, touch dozens, hundreds, thousands in and through their lives. And so there's a sense in which, if you step back just for a moment and think about it, the return on investment, even just in those terms, would be better investing in an institution of higher education rather than some very discrete, local, limited public policy.
Yeah, absolutely. So politics gives the impression, because it is so immediately measurable, that it gives the impression that it's a lot more effective. It's a better return on investment. But you're absolutely right. It's an illusion. And when you look at, what actually happens, for the most part, what you're doing is you're enriching people who run commercials or who, run campaigns or something, right? That's not helping. That's not helpful. But you're right. Yeah. I mean, I think about, as you were talking about affecting people through those students, I think about how many of my students go on to become public school teachers. And when they come out of our program with a love of literature, not just an understanding that it can be useful or that it's something you have to know, but that it's actually beautiful and it's good, and that wisdom can be found in it. And when they get the opportunity to go into public schools and fight, the challenging fight of teaching kids in that context, that's a lot.
Yeah.
There's a lot that can happen through that. And there, I think it has to, the communication, but also, as I said earlier, faith has to come in. I mean, we have to believe that what we're doing is meaningful, even if it doesn't fit into a nice, discrete chart.
Yeah, that's well put. This is my 4th year teaching here. I have a couple kids in local public school, the elementary across the street. And I already have had the experience of a former student teaching my children. I mean, it's already happening, right? Wow. Which is quite wonderful to stumble upon. So let me raise one final issue and question for you, and you can again kind of take your pick. You discuss a few social issues that Christian liberal arts higher education institutions can contribute to in some way or respond to. You mentioned democracy, technology, and racism, which of course presents many different and profound challenges. And I'm not going to ask you to comment on all of those. Rather, given that you mentioned those examples, this project, the Liberating Arts that this interview is a part of, is funded by a CCCU grant, but it's also meant to explore the enduring value of the liberal arts, broadly speaking, not only within contexts of faith. And so one question that comes to mind for someone reading your article is, why should the wider society, why should American society, neighbors and fellow citizens who are not Christians, whether they belong to other religious traditions or are not religious at all, why should they care about institutions like yours and mine? What's the case for our institution's contribution to the common good that isn't limited to our people, our churches, fellow believers, and so forth?
Good. And those are very important things to think through. Just using, the examples that I give in the article, we live at a very strange time in democracy, and I suppose in some sense it's always been a strange time. And one of the benefits of liberal arts broadly is that you can contextualize that within history. What is American democracy? What is a democratic republic? What is it that we have? And why is it worth fighting for? What aspects of it might be flawed, and how can they be improved? You can't begin to answer those questions if you don't know how we got here. You just can't. And I feel like there are a lot of young people who, and frankly, I sort of agree with them, who are desiring radical change in the way that our society works, because they're seeing legitimate flaws and they're not seeing those things improved. But without a foundation, without looking at how we got here and what we went through and the ideas behind it, you can't really offer a way forward. You just can't. You can't. And you can speculate, but you're going to make it's not going to be fruitful. So I think as citizens, as voters, I want our people to have a deep grasp, an enduring grasp of history and the ideas that energized history, and the motives and the desires and the fears that were behind it. The same thing is true of, or a similar thing is true, I think, of technology, right? Universities, particularly residential universities, have opportunities they form communities, and those communities will have habits. And those are opportunities for us as educators and as administrators to require students to use their technology wisely. This can, at the micro level, this happens in the classroom. Explaining to students, this is what this cell phone is doing to you. This is why we're not allowing it in class. I mentioned earlier, attending to texts. So that process of attending to, for example, a poem, I don't want to instrumentalize poetry, as you said, instrumentalize, that's the right language. I don't want to instrumentalize poetry, but honestly, I think reading poetry is probably one of the healthiest ways to combat some of the problems with technology and the way that it scatters our minds. Attending to specific words, learning to love and charitably desire to understand somebody else's words. That's a powerful way of combating the frenetic attention grabbing of cell phones and television and the internet and all these sorts of things. And those things, of course, have tremendous value. Right now, the documentary, which I've not seen because I don't want to be depressed, and I think I probably know what it's going to say, The Social Dilemma on Netflix is having a lot of people talking about, wow, this social media thing is kind of a mess. Yes. So even whether you're a Christian or not, we have some deep problems that we have to deal with. How can we cultivate habits? The communities that we have in colleges can help us do that. And then finally, in my own experience, I mentioned I co-teach this Western civilization course sequence. And so, of course, we go over slavery in America, but also Jim Crow in America. And it's one of my favorite times of the year, because even though it's very hard and it's painful and it's brutal, there's a lot of revelation that goes on. There's a lot of history. I know our schools, I would like to say that they're trying their best, the public and private schools, but there's just a lot of history that students don't really grasp, they don't realize how close it is. So for example, I remember a moment in a class once where we were teaching about sundown laws in Oklahoma, cities in Oklahoma that would not allow African Americans to be in the town after sundown. Otherwise it was, a threat to their lives, or they could be arrested. And this blew the students' minds. It was hard for them to imagine, wow, my grandparents lived during this. This was actually a thing that happened. This is connected to me. There's this ownership. And so when I'm thinking about the racial divisions that we have in our country, there's no silver bullet, but I do think that history, education is a necessary component. And what the liberal arts say is learning these stories, reading slave narratives, reading James Baldwin, W.E.B. Du Bois, reading these authors is a critical part of figuring out how we got here and why it's so serious. And that is a problem that all Americans should be attuned to.
Yeah. I can speak to similar experiences in the classroom. I had one class on Christianity and culture where students could select from a number of books, but touching on these issues. And one student read The Cross and the Lynching Tree by James Cone. And I mean, you could feel just in her paper, you could feel her shaking as a result. I mean, it shook her to the bone in a good way. And I tell students who select I have a few books like that one where I always tell students, I have never had a student who was not grateful that they read this book. Usually they say, I'm so glad you brought this to my attention, for reasons that you just said, that our civic institutions like public schools and other things are always doing their best. But we have students who come in 18, 20 years old who just don't know. And this is the place where they can come to know them. Well, thank you, Alan, for your time, for your work, and for the essay. And we appreciate it, sir.
Thank you.